HOA sent cops who shot my wife at my rank office. So I turned their neighborhood into rubble. I never thought the HOA would go this far. It started with their endless harassment, but when they sent cops who shot my wife right inside my own rank office, I knew the game had changed. They thought I'd bow down. Instead, I made sure their entire neighborhood paid the price. The harassment from the HOA didn't begin with bullets or shattered glass. It started small, in the kind of subtle, insidious ways that most people would brush off if they weren't paying close attention. At first, it was letters stuffed into my mailbox, printed with fake politeness but dripping with threat between the lines. They told me my fence was too high, my driveway too long, my vehicles parked at angles that weren't aesthetically pleasing. They fined me for a shed in my backyard that had been standing for years before I even moved in. I thought it was nothing more than the usual power trip these boards loved to take. A group of neighbors who enjoyed feeling important because they could wave around bylaws and regulations like they were law itself. But it didn't stop. Every week brought a new complaint, each one more absurd than the last. They wanted me to repaint my shutters because the color wasn't in the approved palette. They claimed the way I cut my grass was against neighborhood guidelines. I began to realize it wasn't about rules or appearances. It was about control, about making me bend and bow until I was broken down enough to accept their authority without question. I ignored them at first, paid what I had to, and tried to move on, but they weren't satisfied with compliance. The letters turned into phone calls, the kind where the caller ID was blocked and the voice on the other end never identified themselves. But the message was clear. Stop resisting, stop questioning, or face consequences. My wife told me to keep my head down, to not let them get under my skin. But she didn't see the way they looked at me during HOA meetings, the way they whispered when I entered the room. I could feel it in the air. I was a target. They didn't want me as a neighbor, they wanted me as an example. The fines piled up until they claimed I owed more in fees than I'd ever seen in a single paycheck. They threatened foreclosure on my home, a place I had worked years to afford. I caught them photographing my property from the street, zooming in on cracks in the pavement and smudges on the siding as if they were building a case to present in court. Once, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside my window, only to find muddy prints leading away when I went out in the morning. I knew then this wasn't just about enforcing rules. They were trying to break me psychologically, to corner me until I lashed out so they could paint me as unstable, a danger to the community. I tried reporting it, first to the HOA board itself, which laughed me off, then to local authorities, who said their hands were tied because it was a civil matter. Civil matter. As if the way they were closing in on me wasn't anything to be concerned about. That phrase echoed in my head as I found more signs of their intrusion. My trash was rifled through, important papers missing from my desk drawer, and once I came home to find the lock on my back door tampered with. My wife thought I was imagining it, that I was letting paranoia consume me, but I knew better. They were escalating, and the lack of accountability gave them the confidence to push further. The worst part wasn't just the HOA board. It was the neighbors who stood by and watched. People I'd waved to on morning walks suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations at the mailbox died the moment I showed up. The same people who'd once asked me for help jump-starting their car or carrying groceries now crossed the street to avoid me. They smirked, shuffled papers, and spoke in circles, never giving a straight answer. But their eyes told me everything I needed to know. They weren't after compliance, they were after destruction. They wanted to break my will, to watch me crumble so they could say they were right to target me from the beginning. By then, I knew this wasn't going to stop with fines, letters, or intimidation. This was the beginning of something darker, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, they were closing in. It was a day like any other when the nightmare unfolded. The kind of ordinary morning that tricks you into believing you're safe before everything shatters in an instant. I was in my rank office, sorting through paperwork, while my wife brought me a cup of coffee, smiling the way she always did when she wanted me to take a break. The quiet hum of routine was comforting, a rare moment of peace after weeks of harassment. But that peace was ripped apart when the door slammed open and uniformed cops stormed in, their boots pounding against the floor, their voices barking orders I barely had time to process. My first thought was that this was another intimidation tactic arranged by the HOA, a bluff to scare me into submission, but the moment I saw the barrels of their guns pointed at us, I realized it wasn't a bluff at all. My wife froze, the cup slipping from her hands and shattering across the tile, coffee splashing across her legs as the officers shouted for us to get down. I raised my hands, demanding to know what they thought they were doing, but they didn't answer. Their faces were stone, their eyes cold, as if they weren't even men but machines programmed to follow orders. My wife tried to speak, her voice trembling as she asked them to calm down, to explain why they were here, but before the words were even finished, one of them fired. The sound exploded in the room, deafening, and the force of it knocked her backward, blood blooming across her chest as her body crumpled to the floor. For a moment, time stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could see was the woman I loved lying there, her hand reaching for mine, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief. I remember screaming, lunging toward her, but another officer shoved me back with the butt of his rifle. My body hit the wall hard, pain radiating through my shoulder, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the pool of blood spreading around her, the shallow gasps escaping her lips. I begged them to call an ambulance, to do something, but they just stood there, guns still trained on me as if I were the threat. In that moment, it hit me that they hadn't come for justice or law enforcement. They had come to send a message, the same message the HOA had been whispering for months, now delivered in bullets instead of letters. I can still hear the ringing in my ears from that gunshot, still see the look in her eyes as they dimmed. They didn't even check on her, didn't even flinch as she lay dying. Instead, they barked at me to stay down, their voices flat, like this was routine, like destroying a life was just another task to cross off a list. I kept shouting, my voice raw, demanding to know why, but the only response I got was a muttered wrong place, wrong time from one of them. As if that explained anything. Wrong place, wrong time, as though being in our own office, in our own life, gave them the right to tear it apart. When they finally left, it was without remorse, without acknowledgement of the destruction they'd caused. They didn't arrest me, didn't hand me a warrant, didn't say a word about charges. They just left her there on the floor, bleeding out in my arms, while I scrambled to save her, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial for help. By the time the paramedics arrived, it was too late. I held her hand as the monitors went silent, her grip loosening until there was nothing left to hold on to but the cold. The hours after were a blur, filled with questions that had no answers, with officials who spoke in careful, empty phrases about ongoing investigations and tragic accidents. But I knew the truth. I knew this wasn't random, that the HOA had finally taken their harassment to the ultimate extreme. They'd sent the cops not to protect, not to serve, but to punish, to make sure I understood that resistance came at a cost. And the cost was her life. I sat there in that office long after everyone else had left, staring at the blood-stained floor, my chest hollow, my heart shredded. Every sound, every breath felt wrong, like the world had tilted off its axis. I could still smell her perfume mixed with the metallic tang of blood, a cruel reminder that she had been here, alive, and then ripped away from me in a single moment. It wasn't just murder. It was a warning, a calculated act meant to break me completely. But as I sat there, shaking with rage, I knew one thing for certain. They had just made the worst mistake of their lives. In the days that followed, I realized something even more horrifying than the shooting itself. The silence. The community that had once pretended to be my neighbors. The people who waved when I walked down the street or borrowed tools from my garage, suddenly had nothing to say. Not a single knock on the door to ask if my wife was okay. Not one phone call offering condolences. Not even a card slipped into the mailbox. It was as if her death had been scrubbed from their memory the second it happened, as if acknowledging it would put them in the same crosshairs I had found myself in. Their silence wasn't just apathy. It was complicity. They knew what had happened. They knew who was responsible. And yet they turned their backs, too afraid or too comfortable to care. I'd see them outside, tending to their gardens, walking their dogs, smiling at each other as though the blood that had been spilled only a few streets away didn't matter. I could hear laughter drifting from open windows at night while I sat in the dark, staring at the empty space where my wife used to sit beside me. The absence of outrage cut deeper than any bullet. It was proof that the HOA's grip extended beyond bylaws and fines. It was rooted in fear, in control, in the unspoken understanding that anyone who stepped out of line would suffer the same fate. When I finally gathered the strength to step outside, their eyes followed me, but no one dared to meet my gaze. They whispered behind curtains, their blinds twitching as I walked past, their mouths tight with the kind of nervousness that told me they knew exactly what had happened. It wasn't ignorance. It was willful blindness. I overheard fragments of their conversations when they thought I was out of earshot. We shouldn't get involved. It's not our problem. Better him than us. Each word was another knife, twisting the reality that I had been left alone to drown in grief while the rest of them chose safety over humanity. I thought maybe, just maybe, someone on the board would show some semblance of decency. But when I showed up to the next HOA meeting, the room went silent the moment I walked in. They avoided my eyes, shuffled their papers, and mumbled about moving forward. Not a word about what had happened, not an acknowledgement of the life that had been taken. It was as though my wife had been erased, her existence reduced to a brief pause before they returned to discussing lawn maintenance and street parking. The casual cruelty of their indifference made my blood boil. I looked around that room and realized the truth. Every single person sitting there had chosen their side. They weren't just bystanders, they were accessories. Their silence gave the HOA permission to keep going, to tighten the noose around anyone they targeted next. They didn't care about right or wrong. They cared about staying out of the line of fire, even if it meant letting an innocent woman die without justice. That night, as I walked home, the sound of their muted laughter from the meeting hall followed me, echoing in my ears like a taunt. What struck me most was how quickly they moved on, as though my tragedy was an inconvenience they couldn't be bothered with. A week after the shooting, I saw a flyer for the HOA's summer barbecue pinned to the community board. Fun for the whole family, it read, with smiling cartoon faces and promises of games and prizes. My wife's blood was barely dry on the floor of my office, and they were already planning a party. The sheer audacity of it, the way they brushed her death aside like it was nothing, cemented what I had known from the start. I could expect nothing from these people but betrayal. The silence wasn't just in their actions, but in the way they treated me whenever I crossed their path. If I walked into the local store, conversations died. If I stopped at the gas station, people suddenly found their phones interesting. No one dared to say my name, but I could feel their judgment, their fear, their desperate need to distance themselves from me. It wasn't just about protecting themselves. It was about reinforcing the idea that I was already gone, already cut off from the community. They wanted me to vanish quietly, to carry my grief like a curse while they carried on with their lives untouched. The most painful part of all was knowing that if the roles had been reversed, if it had been one of them who lost their spouse in such a brutal way, my wife would have been the first to show up with a casserole dish and a shoulder to lean on. She believed in kindness, in community, in the idea that people looked out for each other. But standing there alone, staring at a neighborhood that had collectively decided to abandon me, I realized she had been wrong. These weren't neighbors. They were cowards. They were accomplices. They were people who had traded their souls for the illusion of safety. Every day that passed without a word from them hardened something inside me. The grief turned to rage, the loneliness to resolve. Their silence wasn't just deafening. It was fuel, feeding the fire that was building inside me, pushing me toward the inevitable conclusion that if they wouldn't speak up, if they wouldn't stand against the monsters that controlled them, then I would have to do it myself, and I would make sure they heard me loud and clear. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of my wife's absence pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. The HOA thought they had broken me, that the silence of the community would bury me under grief and fear, but they underestimated what they had created. Every insult, every fine, every threat, and finally every drop of blood spilled in my rank office had been adding fuel to a fire they couldn't control. I knew I couldn't sit idle, waiting for their next move. If they had the audacity to send cops to my office and murder my wife in cold blood, then they had already declared war, and I wasn't about to lose without a fight. It wasn't revenge I wanted. It was justice, the kind of justice they could never deliver in their rigged system. So I started planning, not with desperation, but with cold, calculated clarity. I went over every detail of the HOA's operations, every meeting I had ever attended, every note I had taken, every complaint they had filed. I knew their rules inside out, but more importantly, I knew their weaknesses. They loved control, thrived on it, depended on it, and I realized the only way to hit them where it hurt was to dismantle that control piece by piece. I mapped out their routines, their patrols, even the security measures they prided themselves on. I watched the board members come and go, noted which houses were visited most often, and studied their patterns like a hunter stalking prey. But this wasn't something I could do recklessly. One wrong move and they'd paint me as the monster they'd been trying to convince everyone I was. I had to be smarter than them, more patient, more ruthless. I set up in the same office where my wife had been killed, refusing to abandon it, and turned it into the nerve center of my plan. Every wall was lined with papers, notes, and maps, strings connecting names to addresses, rules to loopholes, neighbors to secrets they didn't want exposed. I realized quickly that the HOA wasn't just enforcing regulations. They were running a racket, using fear and fines to control everyone while lining their own pockets. There were records of illegal charges, forged signatures, even hush payments that never made it into official books. The deeper I dug, the filthier it became, and with each discovery, the fire inside me burned hotter. Still, I kept quiet, kept my head down in public, letting them believe I was broken. The whispers about me grew, but I didn't care. I wanted them to think I was retreating into grief, because while they relaxed, I was sharpening every weapon they'd handed me. I knew when their security cameras rotated, when their patrol cars took their coffee breaks, even the exact times the board members slipped out to meet behind closed doors. They thought their power made them untouchable, but I could see the cracks forming in their empire, and I was ready to drive a wedge through every single one. The hardest part was pushing down the rage long enough to think clearly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my wife collapsing to the floor, her blood soaking into the tiles, her last breath stolen because of their greed and cruelty. The urge to storm into their offices and tear everything apart with my bare hands nearly consumed me, but I forced myself to wait. They wanted me reckless. They wanted me to lash out so they could justify finishing the job. I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I would make them choke on their own arrogance, dismantling their precious neighborhood until all that was left was rubble, and they'd have no one to blame but themselves. I started small, testing the waters. Anonymous tips to authorities about their shady financial dealings. Quiet conversations with people they'd wronged, planting seeds of doubt and fear about the HOA's supposed authority. Strategic leaks of documents that revealed just how deep their corruption went. Each move was deliberate, each step designed to weaken their grip without exposing my hand too early. And it worked. I watched the board scramble to contain the rumors, to patch up the holes I had punched in their armor, but they had no idea where the attacks were coming from. At night, when the streets were empty, I'd walk through the neighborhood, taking in the houses that had once felt like a cage around me. I imagined the walls collapsing, the manicured lawns torn apart, the smug smiles of the board members erased forever. It wasn't a fantasy. It was a promise. They had taken everything from me, and I was going to return the favor in a way that made sure they never forgot. The plan was forming piece by piece, solidifying with every sleepless night and every new crack I discovered in their facade. I didn't care how long it took. I didn't care what I had to sacrifice. They wanted to make an example out of me, but they were about to learn that I was the wrong man to target. I realized quickly that the best way to destroy the HOA wasn't with fists or weapons, but with the very tools they had used to torment me. They had always hidden behind their rules, their paperwork, their supposed authority, twisting bylaws into chains to keep everyone under their control. So I decided I would turn those chains back on them, strangle them with their own words, and make sure every piece of their structure collapsed under the weight of their corruption. I started by digging deeper into their records, not the ones they showed the community but the ones they kept hidden, the files tucked away in boxes, the emails they thought no one would ever read. I knew how they operated, how they used technicalities to crush people, and I found those same technicalities could be sharpened into blades. I began submitting anonymous complaints, perfectly worded, using their own bylaws against them. They prided themselves on uniformity, on their endless obsession with appearances, so I highlighted every little violation committed by their most loyal supporters, the ones who thought they were untouchable. Suddenly, the HOA was forced to fine the very people who had always cheered their tyranny, and cracks began to form. The smug neighbors who once turned their backs on me were suddenly getting notices for chipped paint, for garden ornaments outside the approved list, for fences an inch too high. I could almost see the confusion on their faces as they realized the monster they had fed was now turning on them. But that was only the beginning. I leaked documents anonymously to state officials, ones that showed years of mismanaged funds and questionable transactions. Money that had been collected for community improvements had mysteriously disappeared, checks signed by board members that had no record of approval. I knew they'd try to cover it up, to paint the leaks as fabrications, but the seeds were planted, and whispers spread like wildfire. The same neighbors who had been silent when my wife's blood stained the floor of my office were now murmuring about missing money, about leaders who weren't as squeaky clean as they pretended to be. Every night I added another layer to the plan. I disrupted their meetings not by showing up, but by making sure they couldn't keep control of the crowd. Anonymous flyers slipped under doors exposed their hypocrisy, listing every petty rule they'd enforced while breaking bigger ones behind closed doors. People began asking questions they couldn't easily dodge, and for the first time, I saw fear in their eyes when I passed them in the street. They had thrived on fear for years, feeding on it like vultures, and now they were tasting it themselves. I went further, targeting the very systems they believed made them invincible. Their surveillance cameras, which they had used to intimidate residents, mysteriously glitched, feeds looping or cutting out during key hours. Their newsletters, once filled with smug announcements and warnings, started appearing with errors, lines of text replaced with accusations and evidence of their corruption. I had friends in low places, people who knew how to slip into networks unnoticed, and they owed me favors. The board didn't know who was behind it, but they knew someone was dismantling their power, piece by piece, and they were powerless to stop it. The beauty of it was that I didn't need to raise my voice, didn't need to threaten anyone directly. The HOA had built their empire on fear and paperwork, and I was simply turning their weapons back on them, showing the neighborhood that the rulers they had feared were nothing more than cowards hiding behind signatures and rules. People who had once shunned me began to whisper about how maybe the board wasn't as powerful as it claimed. Maybe their authority wasn't so absolute. Doubt is a powerful thing, and once it takes root, it spreads faster than any fire. As the weeks passed, I saw the shift. Meetings that were once filled with smug laughter and pointed stares were now filled with raised voices and accusations. Board members turned on each other, desperate to shift the blame, desperate to keep their carefully built facades from crumbling. The same neighbors who had looked away when my wife lay dying were now demanding answers, demanding accountability. The cracks had become fissures, and the HOA's once iron grip was starting to slip. I didn't stop there. I made sure the community saw their so-called leaders for what they truly were. Photos of board members meeting secretly with contractors who were funneling money under the table. Recordings of whispered conversations about how to silence dissent. Evidence they thought was buried so deep it would never see the light of day. All of it laid out for the community to judge. And they judged harshly. The very people the board had relied on to keep their power intact were now questioning every decision, every action, and the board could do nothing but scramble to keep control. Through it all, I never revealed myself. They didn't know where the blows were coming from, and that made them more afraid than anything else. They knew someone was out there, someone who had the power to tear their little empire apart, and they couldn't stop it. Every sleepless night they spent wondering when the next hit would come was nothing compared to the sleepless nights I had spent staring at the empty space where my wife should have been. The day finally came when all the pieces of my plan came together, when the weight of everything I had done pressed down on their neighborhood like a storm they couldn't outrun. It didn't start with an explosion or a dramatic confrontation. It started with silence, the kind that settles in when people know something is wrong but don't yet understand how bad it really is. The board members woke up to find their emails flooded with leaked documents, their names tied to scandals they couldn't deny, their reputations dragged through the mud not by rumor but by undeniable proof. Neighbors who had once bowed to them now stood on their lawns, waving the evidence in their hands, demanding explanations they couldn't give. The control they had so carefully built crumbled in front of them, and the looks on their faces told me they finally knew what it felt like to be powerless. But I wasn't done. Their bank accounts, once swollen with the funds they had stolen under the guise of community dues, were suddenly frozen under investigations. Contractors they had secretly funneled money to began cutting ties, afraid of being dragged into the firestorm. Their once loyal allies, terrified of going down with them, turned their backs without hesitation, leaving them stranded and exposed. I watched from a distance as their empire collapsed in real time, as the people who once treated them like untouchable kings and queens now shouted in their faces, demanding answers, demanding justice. The neighborhood itself began to change. The manicured lawns they had forced everyone to maintain grew wild as people stopped caring about their precious rules. The surveillance cameras that had once been their eyes and ears now sat useless, their feeds corrupted and blank. Meetings were canceled, newsletters stopped arriving, and the whispers that once circled about me now circled about them. Their fortress of order had turned into a battlefield of chaos, and they had no weapons left to fight with. I remember walking through the streets that day, feeling the eyes of the neighbors on me. But this time it wasn't the gaze of avoidance or fear. It was a mix of awe and something else, something closer to respect. They didn't say my name, but I could tell they knew who had done this, who had pulled the rug out from under the HOA and left their neighborhood in ruins. They didn't thank me, didn't dare approach, but their silence was different now. It wasn't complicity, it was acknowledgement. For once, they weren't pretending nothing had happened. The board tried to fight back. They called emergency meetings, begged the community to trust them, promised investigations that would clear their names. But every time they tried to speak, another piece of evidence surfaced. Another document or recording that proved their corruption ran deeper than anyone had imagined. Their words carried no weight anymore. Their authority nothing but a crumbling mask. They had ruled with fear, and now that fear was gone, replaced with anger from the very people they had controlled for so long. What struck me most was how quickly the tide turned. The same neighbors who had once stayed silent now shouted the loudest, emboldened by the collapse of the board's power. They demanded resignations, demanded accountability, demanded the destruction of the HOA itself. And as the board members stumbled, as their carefully crafted neighborhood turned against them, I felt a cold satisfaction settle in my chest. They had taken my wife, they had tried to take my life, and now I had taken everything they had ever built. I didn't need to raise my voice or step into the spotlight. My work was done in the shadows, where they couldn't reach me, where they couldn't stop me. The rubble wasn't physical, though I often imagined their houses collapsing under the weight of their lies. It was deeper, more devastating. Their reputations were ash, their power shattered, their neighborhood nothing more than a shell of what it once was. At night, as I stood in the doorway of the office where it had all begun, I thought of my wife. I could almost see her smile, hear her laugh, feel her hand in mine. She hadn't wanted me to fight them, hadn't wanted me to sink into the darkness, but they hadn't given me a choice. I whispered to her that it was done, that they could never hurt us again, that the empire built on fear and blood had finally been reduced to nothing. The HOA had thought they could silence me, break me, erase me. Instead, I had turned their neighborhood into rubble, leaving nothing behind but the memory of what they had done and the lesson that some people can't be controlled, can't be broken no matter how hard you try. 1.